Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and thank you all for coming. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm happy and excited to share with you the inspiration behind my historical novels and my writing journey. I was born and raised in China. It was an isolated country when I was growing up. We did not know anything about the outside world except what we were told. We were told that America was hell. American soldiers were devils. They're coward and cruel. This is the kind of image I grew up with. We were not told that Americans had participated in the war against Japan in China and made vital contributions. I had never heard of the Flying Tigers before I came to this country. Of course, never in my wildest dream could I imagine that one day I would write a book about American heroes. Well, actually, 2 books. The main character in both of them is the same American pilot who bravely fought the Japanese in World War II in China. Most Americans think of World War II as beginning on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. By then, China had already fought the Japanese for 10 years. As early as 1931, Japan had launched an undeclared war and conquered the Northeast Territory. 6 years later, in July 1937, they started a full-scale invasion, and soon Peking fell, Shanghai was captured, and Nanking, the capital of the Republic of China, became Japan's next target. Before the full-scale invasion, Japanese military boasted that they could conquer China, the entire country, in 3 months. They had a lot more advanced military. Or for example, they had 3,000 aircraft, where China had only 300. But it took them more than 3 months to conquer Shanghai, one city. And during the fight, the Japanese suffered heavy losses. That enraged the Japanese. They marched towards Nanking with anger and madness. Along the way, they followed a policy called 3 O's policy: loot all, burn all, and kill all. They turned villages into ghost villages and towns into ghost towns, even cities into ghost cities. Knowing the Japanese intention, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist government, fled the city on December 9th, 1937, shifting the burden of defense to a general. General Tan vowed to live or die with Nanking. His troops, 90,000 of them, transformed the streets of Nanking into battlefields. Nanking had its advantage for defense. A massive stone wall built hundreds of years ago in Ming Dynasty encircled the entire city. There were also natural barriers like the Yangtze River and tall mountains nearby. However, several days into the fight, Chiang Kai-shek changed his mind. He wanted to save his troops, so he ordered to retreat. This created a chaos because by then, the Japanese had already surrounded the entire city, and the Chinese soldiers had no easy way to retreat. They were trapped. On December 13th, 1937, 4 days after Chiang Kai-shek left the city, the Japanese captured Nanking. And immediately, the Japanese soldiers started an unspeakable massacre. In 6 weeks, they killed 300,000 Chinese, including disarmed soldiers, and raped over 20,000 girls and women from age 8 to age 80. Therefore, this event is also called the Rape of Nanking. I'm going to show you a few slides about atrocity. There were hundreds of pictures just like those, taken mostly by the Japanese soldiers. But even with all those pictures, there's still people in Japan denying what happened in Nanking. And by any chance, if you already read my first book, I wrote a scene based on this picture. Surrounded by beautiful mountains and the Yangtze River, rich in art and history, Nanking was a charming city. But the Japanese turned it into a hell on earth. For weeks, the streets were littered with dead bodies, and the air reeked of rotten human flesh. At the height of the massacre, the Yangtze River actually turned red. On the verge of this horrible massacre, Jasmine Bai, a beautiful college student, returned to Nanking. She was too late to save her parents, but in time to witness the horrors. She survived the massacre thanks to a group of Westerners and mostly Americans. With nothing but courage and compassion, this small group of Westerners established the international safety zone that accommodated and saved 300,000 refugees, half of the population of the city. The other half of the people were all killed. Because of this experience, Jasmine developed her hatred towards the Japanese and her love for the Americans. Later, when she found a badly wounded American pilot near a remote village in Yunnan province where she was hiding from the war, she risked her life to save him. This is a fictitious village. Along with her two cousins, Daisy and Birch, a whole village opened its arm to heal and to protect this wounded American pilot. Danny Hardy, this pilot, belonged to a group called the American Volunteer Group. It was formed in the spring of 1941 under President Roosevelt's executive order. Since the US wasn't at war with Japan yet, US military pilots were secretly recruited to join this group. 100 pilots plus 200 supporting members traveled to China with fake passports and enlisted in the Chinese Air Force. like my character, Danny Hardy, they were young and adventurous, but they had no combat experience. They were not even trained to fly P-40, the plane they were going to use. So the Japanese thought very little of the small group of inexperienced American pilots. By then, they had already fought China for many years, and they had experienced pilots and a lot more advanced aircraft. But the American volunteer group had a great leader. General Chennault, a colonel at the time, was a retired Army officer and a very experienced pilot. He had been in China since 1937, and he studied the way the Japanese fly and fight, and he taught those young men well. And by the way, I got a chance to talk to his granddaughter, and it's such a pleasure to thank her for her grandfather's contribution to China. Their first victory came on December 20, 1941, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. On that day, 10 Japanese bombers showed up to bomb Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province. They had done this for years without much resistance. But on that day, 10 bombers showed up. Only one made it home to tell the Japanese leaders that American pilots were in China. With sheer determination and courage, the American volunteer group destroyed, in a little more than half a year, destroyed 500,000 tons of Japanese supplies and 296 Japanese aircraft. This is the official number. The unofficial number actually doubled. And their victories gave hope to the Chinese people, to the Americans, and to the other allies. This is P-40. And as you can see, the plane was decorated with a shark face. And the decoration was for a psychological reason. As an island nation, Japanese were supposed to be afraid of shark attack. But the Chinese people did not know much about sharks. They knew how powerful a tiger could be. There are sayings like 如虎添翼, directly translated into adding wings to a tiger, which means giving power to an already mighty powerful creature, man, or event. So the Chinese people called this group of courageous American pilots 飞虎, the flying tigers. Each flying tiger was issued a bloodshed. It's a piece of cloth sewed to the back of their flight jacket. In Chinese character, it reads, "This foreigner has come to China to help in the war effort. Soldiers and civilians, one and all, should rescue and protect him." And this is exactly what the Chinese people did in my book. They risked their lives to help this wounded American pilot. And pay attention to this bloodshed. I'll come back later in my talk. So when this American pilot's wings were damaged, the Chinese people were the wings of this flying tiger. They healed his wounds and helped him to soar back into the sky. Of course, I won't be able to tell you the detail about how they rescued him. But I will share with you a historical fact. A wounded American pilot returned to the US. At a press conference, He named the village in order to thank the Chinese people for saving him. The Japanese spies in this country picked up the information and sent troops in China to retaliate. Everyone in the village was killed. And that's what inspired me to write this book. I cried when I read the very first review. He called it a smashing historical account of China's chilling bloodbath during World War II. I knew then that my characters, Danny, Jasmine, Birch, Daisy, they will live not only in my heart, but also in other people's hearts. I actually cried many times when I wrote the book. The characters became so real to me that I wondered what happened to them after the rescue. And that's how I started writing the sequel. It's because of my own curiosity. And this time, curiosity did not kill a cat. It created a book. So in Will of a Tiger, once again, readers will meet the characters from the first book, especially Danny Hardy, the American pilot, and Birch Bai, a Chinese pilot who participated in his rescue. Birch was also Jasmine's cousin. The two men became best friends, teammates, and sworn brothers. They vowed to protect one another, and their wills were tested many times. In the summer of 1945, after taking many courageous missions together, they were captured by the Japanese. Now, what kind of life did they have in a Japanese camp? Most people in this country know what happened in World War II in Europe. We know how brutal Nazis treated their enemies and their POWs. Now, what about Japanese? I'm going to show you some statistic data. So according to the US Congressional Research Service, the death rate of American pilots, American POWs, is 1% in German camp. The number is so different. 40% of American POWs died in Japanese camps. This number alone tells you a grim story. Many POWs died of starvation, slavery, torture, or disease. And this number is based on the American POWs. Although Japanese treated Americans terribly, they treated Chinese even worse. For example, during the Nanking massacre, they killed all the Chinese soldiers they could find. They even went inside the international safety zone to search for Chinese soldiers to kill. I wrote a scene based on this fact. On August 6, 1945, US dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan. And the day after, the two pilots were interrogated and tortured for the information about the nuclear weapon. And this is also based on a historical fact. An American pilot was captured and questioned by the Japanese. He did not know anything about the nuclear weapon, but under torture, he gave a false confession. He said there were 100 atomic bombs. And this number, ironically, probably played some important role in Japan's decision to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, ending the World War II. But days before the war ended, Danny and Birch faced another life and death situation. Now, what did each of them do to save the other? And how did they do it when their lives were not in their control? But survival was only the beginning of a long, hard battle, especially for someone like Birch. On top of physical disability, emotional pain, and survival's guilt, he had to face the dreadful reality in China. Since 1927, the nationalists and the communists had fought for the control of the country. The Japanese invasion brought the two sides together to form a united front to counter the foreign invasion. Once their common enemy was defeated, the two sides resumed fighting. A year after the war against Japan ended, the communists and the nationalists started a civil war in 1946, and it lasted for 3 years. Once again, the country was in chaos, and millions of people died during that time. By the end of 1949, the communists took over the mainland China, and the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, dividing the country into two unbridgeable parts. What would someone like Birch do? He and his father had worked for the nationalists for many years. If he stayed in mainland China, he might be put in jail or even worse, be killed. But if he left for Taiwan, he would leave his loved ones behind, and he wouldn't fulfill a promise he made to his best friend. Many people faced the same dilemma, and their decisions decided the fate of their life, including my grandparents. As soon as they took over, the communists started a campaign. It was designed to eliminate the nationalists. This is their policy. Lenient treatment to those who confess frankly, severe punishment to those who remain stubborn. And when they say severe punishment, they meant death. This poster is from that time period, and it shows how much the communists demonized the nationalists. Hundreds of thousands of people were put in jail, and many of them were executed. In Taiwan, the nationalist government was just as worried about a communist invasion. Martial law was issued in 1949, and it lasted for almost 4 decades. There was an inhumane policy. They would rather capture 100 innocent people than let one guilty person go free. And that number was quoted as high as 3,000. Everyone was afraid, and no one was immune. Even the ones who worked for the nationalist government, including Birch and his father. This time period is called White Terror. Now, how could anybody live a meaningful life under such terrible situation? I hope you'll read my book and find out. So from Chongqing to Yunnan, then from Taiwan to San Francisco, Danny and Birch remained brothers, no matter they were together or apart. Will of a Tiger is an epic journey of survival, hardship, friendship, brotherhood, and, of course, love. Both books are works of fiction, historical fiction. But to me, they're also personal. My mom and grandma had lived comfortably in Nanking for many years before the Japanese invasion. They left the city days before the massacre. My mom was only 8 years old. Her family and my father's family ended up in Chongqing. After the fall of Nanking, Chongqing became the wartime capital. But at the same time, it became the target of Japanese terror campaign. For years, the Japanese bombed the city, and the Chinese had no way of protecting itself. I also wrote a scene about the bombing of Chongqing in my first book. My father was only 4 years old at the beginning of the bombing. He told me many times about the experience, the sight, the sound, the smell. He had nightmares for years. Once, his family lost everything except a small pre-packed suitcase. It was full of my grandpa's and my grandma's manuscripts. They were both professors and writers. So as a Chinese, I'm grateful to the Flying Tigers' bravery and sacrifice. Without their help, the course of the Chinese history might have been changed, and my family may not have survived. I may not even existed in the first place. As a US citizen, I'm honored to write books about American heroes. It's such a privilege to do so. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. But how did I do it? As you can tell, English isn't my native tongue. I was born and raised in a family of scholars. My parents and my grandparents were all professors at Wuhan University. Even before I was born, they bought tons of books for me. But I didn't get a chance to read most of them. During the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards came to our home and took most of them away. I read few leftovers again and again because not many books were available to us. For almost 10 years, all the libraries were closed and all the bookstores had nothing except political stuff. Like other kids in the country, I was hungry for books. But I was luckier than most of them. I had a great father. My hometown, Wuhan, is hot and humid in the summer. It can reach 40 degrees Celsius, that's 104 degrees with 90% humidity. We had no air conditioning, no electric fans. And during those hot summer evenings, we sat outside, surrounded by neighboring kids with a fan in his hand. My father told us lots of stories. From classic Chinese novels to classic Western novels. The first time I heard about Utah was from Sherlock Holmes. I had no idea, of course, at the time, that one day I would end up in this part of the world and see the amazing landscape with my own eyes. I fell in love with literature because of my father. But writing was a dangerous career. My grandma was the first Chinese woman to receive a master's degree in the UK, and she became a famous writer. By the way, I just visited Scotland and Ireland. It's so amazing to walk on the campus that my grandmother started 100 years ago. She was there from 1916 to 1921, Edinburgh University. Yeah, it's an amazing experience. I talked to the library over there, and they also sent me information about my grandmother and bought my books. So my books will be with my grandmother's university. My aunt received her master's degree in Michigan. She became a famous translator. She translated Peter Pan, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and all those classics into Chinese. But both of them were wrongfully accused as counter-revolutionary rightists, which is equivalent to a bad person or criminal. My aunt was sent to a labor camp for many years. My grandma was fired from her university job and ordered to sweep streets for many years. Later, she was kicked out of her university housing and sent back to her hometown. She died there alone. I had no choice. I had to choose something safer. So I studied science. By the time I graduated from Wuhan University, it was a prestigious program between China and the United States in the biological field. 50 students from the entire country were allowed to enter this program. And after taking a series of exams, I became one of the lucky students. With poor English, little knowledge of this country, and 500 borrowed dollars, literally 5 $100 bills, I came to the US. 5.5 years later, I received a Ph.D. from University of Rochester. And later, I worked as a scientist at UNC Chapel Hill for many years. When I was in China, I learned English as foreign language in high school. I was a top student for almost all subjects, except English, at least for a period of time. Well, why would anybody learn English when the country was totally isolated from the outside world? It's useless. It was the reality, but also the excuse I gave to my parents for not studying hard. Deep down, I had a totally different reason. It was because I was too shy to let anybody hear my voice. And it's hard to learn a language without speaking up. When I came to this country, TV became my English teacher. I had no concept of commercial. When the program changed suddenly in the middle, I was so confused, I thought maybe somehow accidentally I touched the remote control. It took me days to figure it out. Because at the time, there were only 2 stations broadcasting in China from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. nonstop. Although I published a number of scientific papers, fiction writing was still a faraway dream. It was it's very different from scientific writing. I started writing not because I wanted to publish any books, but because I needed help. Like I said, I was very shy and fearful when I was young. I was afraid of pretty much anything and everything, including public speaking. And later trapped in an unhappy marriage, I became more and more negative, to a point depressed. One day, I sat on the floor and folded myself into a ball. In my mind, I watched myself hanging on a cliff. I was slipping inch by inch down that cliff. I had to make a choice, either to let myself fall or somehow find a way to save myself. I turned to books. I read tons of self-help books, and you'll be amazed how many self-help books you can find in this country. There was no such thing in China. And one of them says, if you write down 5 positive things a day, in 21 days, you'll be able to switch your mindset from negative to positive. So I started by jotting down words or simple phrases. In time, words became sentences, sentences changed to paragraphs, and then paragraphs turned into pages. I did not change in 21 days. It took me 2 years. But the end result is remarkable. I'm happy to say I'm no longer a negative person. I started to open up. I became more active and adventurous. I learned to hike, to dance, to travel by myself. I drove all the way from North Carolina to Alaska on my own. And I learned to fly and received the private pilot license. And then I went skydiving. And because of writing every day for 2 years, I started writing short stories and then novels. And all those experiences helped me to be a better writer. And for one thing, I picked the topic of the flying tiger partly because of my own admiration for the fighter pilots. I know how hard it is to fly. I just can't imagine anybody can fly and fight at the same time. Well, it's still a long, hard journey, full of frustration, self-doubts, disappointment, but it filled with more joy, satisfaction, and excitement. And I was so lucky all along the way, many people helped me. Last year, I achieved every writer's dream. I received a contract from a publisher for both of my books at the same time. Thank you, thank you. Very grateful, thank you. Thank you. In June, the first one was published, and this year, the second one was released. And as you can tell, both of them have received excellent reviews, and they were featured in more than 24 newspapers, Chinese and English newspapers. And earlier this year, I was interviewed on NPR. It was such an honor to talk to Frank Stasio face-to-face for an hour. It was an amazing experience. I was so nervous. And if you have my website, you can check the whole interview. He asked a lot of questions about my family. And I was an invited speaker for the Flying Tiger World War II Veterans Reunion. Just finished. I came from there, my friends I met over there. It's just such an honor to speak to a group of people so close to the flying tigers. I can't describe the excitement I felt. And they were so nice to me. I'm thrilled that my books have touched people's heart. Many readers told me that they cried when they read my book. It really happened in one of the darkest hours in Chinese history. Those people from like 9 years old to a middle-aged man to a 90-year-old lady, so it touched many people's heart. One gentleman attended my presentation 4 times and gave me a puzzle he built. It's a 600-piece puzzle. Took him 2 months to build, and he gave it to me. And that brings me to the last story I'm going to share. Three months ago, a gentleman attended my presentation at Sedona Library. He brought his father's flight jacket. It's because of this bloodshed, remember this bloodshed, that Jasmine saved Danny. In Chinese character, it reads, "This foreigner has come to China to help the war effort. Soldiers and civilians, one and all, should rescue him." Thank you. So we started to communicate. 2 days later, he finished reading my book. He told me he cried. And that night, before he went to sleep, he asked his father's permission to share the jacket with me. His father passed away many years ago. And he asked for any sign. He woke up by a pure yellow bird tapping on his window, nodding yes. He has lived in that house for almost 20 years and had never seen a yellow bird like that before. He told me people wanted to buy this jacket for $5,000. He didn't sell. A museum asked him to donate. He did not donate. His son wanted to have this jacket. He did not give it to his son. He gave it to me. The reason is the similarity between my story and his father's experience, just striking. Both Danny Hardy, my character, and his father, Ed Alexander, were shot down by the Japanese in southern China. Both lost their best friend during the mission. Both had leg injuries and malaria. Both were rescued by the Chinese villagers, treated with herbal medicine, and sheltered for several months, where the Japanese were desperately searching for them. He said, "I wrote his father's story without knowing his father." It is such a heartwarming story, really. Since his mother made him to promise to keep the jacket in the family, he asked me to be his sister. So now I'm the sister of a flying tiger's son. I'm part of a flying tiger's family. Thank you. Truly, this is a heartwarming story. I wrote the books because their story touched me, their bravery touched me deeply. And then my story touched a son of a flying tiger. And in turn, they touched me again so deeply that I started writing the third of the trilogy. And that's why I wanted you to sign up so that I can send email to you once the third one is published. I will definitely keep sharing the story of the flying tiger. And I hope you will all help me by reading the book, by telling your friends, by posting reviews, which is really hard to come by giving me opportunities to share the information. And together, we're going to keep the spirit of the flying tigers alive. Thank you very much. Thank you.